He told a room full of journalists that I was too distracted by maternity leave to understand real corporate strategy. 3 months later, I blocked his company's IPO from across a boardroom table as the silent investor he'd been flying to Toronto to meet for over a year. 10 years ago, I was the woman they quietly moved aside. Today, I'm the reason his Bay Street dreams are on hold indefinitely. And it started with one sentence he never imagined would follow him this far. Before we go any further, if stories like this speak to something you've lived or something you've felt, consider subscribing. It's free, and you'd be joining a community that refuses to stay quiet. Now, let's get into it. The evening Daniel Marsh opened his mouth and changed the course of my life. He was standing at the podium of the Canadian Business Leadership Gala at the Fairmont Royal York in Toronto. He'd just accepted an award for innovation in legal strategy, ironic, given what came next. The room was dressed in the particular shade of self-congratulation that only Bay Street insiders can produce. Dark suits, champagne flutes, the smell of ambition trying to pass itself off as accomplishment. I was seated 4 tables back. I'd been invited as a guest of my former mentor, who chaired the gala's selection committee. Nobody at that table knew who I was beyond a name on a place card. That was entirely by design. Daniel had put on weight since the last time I'd seen him. His hair was thinner, his confidence somehow thicker. He thanked his partners, thanked his wife, thanked his board, and then, the way powerful men often do when they feel safe, he got comfortable. He loosened the tie on his prepared remarks and went off script. "You know what the difference is between leaders who last and leaders who fade," he said, grinning at the audience. "Consistency. You can't be building something serious and then step away for a year and a half because life got complicated." He paused for the laugh he knew was coming. "I had a senior associate, once brilliant woman, truly, but the moment she went on maternity leave, we all knew she wasn't coming back the same. And she didn't. Some people are built for the long game, and some people make other choices." The laugh came. Polite. Knowing. The kind of laugh that fills a room because no one wants to be the person who doesn't get the joke. I set down my champagne glass. Quietly. Without looking up. My daughter was 11 months old when Daniel Marsh called me into his office at Whitmore and Marsh LLP and told me the partnership track had been restructured. He used the word restructured 4 times in that meeting. He never once used the word maternity. He didn't have to. The timeline said everything. I'd returned from my leave 8 weeks earlier, billing at full capacity, having closed 2 files remotely during the final trimester when I shouldn't have even been working. None of it mattered. The decision had been made while I was home learning how to keep another human being alive. I signed the separation agreement, took the severance, and said nothing publicly. My former colleagues assumed I'd gone home for good. Daniel Marsh, I can only imagine, forgot about me entirely within a month. That was his first mistake. What Daniel didn't know, what very few people knew, was that the 18 months I'd spent on leave had not been spent the way he assumed. Yes, I was a mother. Yes, I was exhausted in ways no performance review could ever measure. But I was also watching the market the way I always had, reading prospectuses during night feeds, building something from the ground up during the narrow windows my daughter allowed me. My former brother-in-law, who ran a small family office out of Calgary, had been pushing me for years to formalize the investment instincts I'd been exercising informally since law school. During my leave, we finally did it. We structured Thornfield Capital as a numbered Ontario corporation with a blind mandate, meaning our LPs knew the fund existed and had committed capital, but the operating identity of its principals was protected under a confidentiality structure that is entirely legal and not uncommon among family offices and boutique VC funds in this country. We weren't hiding. We were simply not advertising. By the time Daniel made his remarks at the Fairmont, Thornfield Capital had quietly participated in the early stage rounds of 11 companies across Ontario and British Columbia. One of those companies had already gone public on the TSX Venture Exchange. 2 more were preparing for listings. Our total AUM was not what the major funds managed, but our return profile was exceptional, and the right people in the right rooms were starting to notice the fund without knowing its face. The company Daniel was now running, Northgate Systems, a mid-sized software firm he'd co-founded after leaving Whitmore and Marsh needed capital for its TSX main board listing. The deal required an anchor institutional investor with a strong enough track record to give the OSC comfort and to anchor the book. His investment bankers at a mid-market boutique on King Street had been circulating the opportunity for 4 months. 3 of those months, Thornfield Capital had been quietly running due diligence. When I drove home from the gala that night, my daughter asleep in her car seat in the back, I gave myself exactly the length of the Gardiner Expressway to feel everything I needed to feel. The anger, the particular exhaustion of being erased and then watching the person who erased you be celebrated for it. The memory of signing that agreement in a boardroom where nobody made eye contact. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I had made a decision. Not out of rage, out of precision. My business partner, I'll call him Marcus, which is not his name, was not surprised when I called him that night. We had spoken about Northgate Systems twice that week. The due diligence was nearly complete. The question had been whether to proceed. We proceed, I said. But I want to be in the room when it closes. Marcus understood immediately. He asked no further questions. The structure of what followed was not complicated, but it required patience. Thornfield Capital would signal its interest in anchoring the Northgate IPO through our advisors, maintaining the blind mandate throughout. This was standard practice for us. What was not standard was the condition I added. The final commitment would require a face-to-face meeting with Northgate's founding partners before we signed. This condition was disclosed to the bankers as a standard governance requirement on our end, not unusual for an anchor investor committing at the size we were discussing. I want to be clear about what this was and was not. It was not sabotage. I had done full diligence on Northgate Systems. The company was legitimate, the technology was sound, the market opportunity was real. If I had found it to be a bad investment, I would have walked away regardless of who was running it. I am not in the business of burning money for personal satisfaction. But I was in the business of making decisions, and I had decided that Daniel Marsh deserved to understand, fully and completely, what it meant to dismiss someone he thought he'd already finished. The weeks that followed were ordinary for me and, I later learned, increasingly not ordinary for Daniel. Northgate's bankers had been trying to close the anchor position for longer than was comfortable. Several institutional investors had passed. The TSX listing timeline was under pressure. When Thornfield's interest was confirmed, I'm told Daniel told his co-founder it was the break they'd been waiting for. He flew to Toronto twice from Vancouver, specifically hoping to arrange the meeting. Both times, our advisor communicated that the principals were unavailable due to prior commitments, and could they please coordinate through the fund's legal counsel. I heard this from Marcus, who delivered it with the particular neutral tone of a man who has known me long enough to understand that I do not need commentary. During this period, I was not idle. I was managing our other portfolio companies, attending to my daughter, and preparing. The preparation was not dramatic. I reviewed every public statement Daniel had made about Northgate. I read every piece of press about him and Whitmore and Marsh going back a decade. I spoke with 2 former associates who had left that firm, both women, both with stories that rhymed uncomfortably with mine, not to gather ammunition, but to understand whether what I remembered was real or whether time had softened the edges of something harder. It was real. If anything, it was sharper than I'd remembered. The meeting was scheduled for a Wednesday morning in late October, at a boardroom in our legal counsel's offices on Bay Street. Marcus would be present, our lawyer would be present. Northgate's 2 founding partners, their CFO, and their investment banking advisors would be on the other side of the table. I would be introduced simply as a principal of Thornfield Capital. I arrived 20 minutes early. I wore a charcoal blazer and no jewelry except my wedding ring, which I still wear because it belonged to someone I loved, not because of what anyone else might read into it. I poured myself a coffee from the credenza and stood at the window looking down at the street. When the elevator doors opened and Daniel Marsh walked into that boardroom, the first thing he did was look at Marcus. He extended his hand. He introduced himself. He smiled the smile of a man who believes the meeting is already won. Then he looked at me. The recognition was not immediate. It took approximately 4 seconds. I watched it happen. The initial polite smile of a man greeting a stranger. Then the faint recalibration as something familiar registered. Then the stillness that moves through a person when the pieces land in the wrong order. "Rebecca," he said. Not a question. Not a greeting. Just the word, dropped into the room like something he needed to put down. "Daniel," I said. "It's good to finally make this work. We've been trying to get in the same room for a while." I let that sit. I did not smile in a way that telegraphed anything. I gestured toward the chairs and we all sat down. What followed was 90 minutes of the most precise conversation I have ever been part of. Our lawyer walked through Thornfield's standard representations. I asked questions about Northgate's integration strategy, their enterprise sales pipeline, their churn metrics in the mid-market segment. Daniel's CFO answered most of them. Daniel himself said very little. His co-founder, who had no history with me, was relaxed and engaged and clearly had no idea why the energy in the room felt the way it did. Midway through the meeting, Daniel attempted to reassert himself. He walked through Northgate's founding thesis, the gap in the market, the technology advantage, the 5-year runway. It was a good pitch. Rehearsed but grounded. Under other circumstances, I would have simply said yes and we would have moved to terms. Instead, I asked him about leadership continuity. One thing our investment committee focuses on, I said, keeping my voice level, is how founding teams handle transition. Key personnel risk. How you retain talent, particularly at the senior level when the company is scaling fast. I paused. We've seen funds lose momentum because the culture at the top doesn't support long-term retention of strong contributors. Daniel held my gaze. I held his. We've built a strong team, he said carefully. I'm glad to hear that, I said. We'll want to speak with a few of your senior leaders as part of the final close process. Standard for us at this stage. His CFO nodded. His co-founder said they were happy to facilitate. Daniel said nothing. When the meeting ended and we were walking toward the elevator, his co-founder stepped aside to speak with Marcus. That left Daniel and me standing briefly alone near the boardroom door. He spoke quietly. I didn't know it was you. I know, I said. Rebecca, what happened at the firm? I'm not here about the firm, I said. I'm here about an investment decision. I looked at him directly, which we haven't made yet. The elevator arrived. I stepped in. The doors closed. I want to be precise about what happened next because I think the details matter. I did not pull Thornfield's interest from Northgate. I did not leak anything to the press. I did not make calls to poison the deal. What I did was exercise the governance rights any anchor investor is entitled to exercise. I requested the senior leadership interviews I had mentioned. Those interviews were conducted by Marcus and our associate over the following 2 weeks. What they found was not fabricated and was not a surprise to anyone paying attention. 2 of Northgate's 4 senior directors were actively exploring external opportunities. 1 had received an offer. The culture issues were real and documented in internal Glassdoor reviews that any thorough diligence process would have surfaced. The OSC had also sent a supplementary disclosure request regarding a related party transaction in the previous fiscal year, not unusual, but requiring a satisfactory response before any listing could proceed. Thornfield Capital sent a letter to Northgate's advisors indicating that we were pausing our participation pending resolution of the disclosure matter and the leadership stability concerns. The letter was professional. It cited specific line items. It was the letter any responsible institutional investor would send under these circumstances. The effect of that letter on Northgate's IPO timeline was significant. Without an anchor investor, the book was incomplete. The bankers pushed the listing. A second institutional investor who had been considering a smaller position also paused. The TSX filing was delayed by 2 quarters. I learned most of this from Marcus, who tracked it the way he tracks all our portfolio adjacencies. He mentioned it the same way he mentions everything briefly, factually, moving on. The call from Daniel came on a Friday afternoon, 11 days after our letter. I was picking my daughter up from her daycare when my phone showed an unknown Vancouver number. I let it go to voicemail. He called again. I answered. I'd like to talk, he said. Not through advisors. All right, I said. I've been thinking about what you said. About culture. About retention. A pause. And about what happened when you left the firm. Those are 2 different conversations, I said. Maybe they're not, he said. I waited. I made an assumption about you, he said. When you went on leave. I thought I assumed the absence meant something it didn't. And then at the gala, I said something, he stopped. I didn't know you were in the room. I know, I said again. Does that change anything? I watched my daughter toddle toward me across the daycare parking lot. Her jacket half unzipped, one boot untied, carrying a drawing she'd made that I couldn't yet see. I thought about the night I'd signed that separation agreement. I thought about the Gardner Expressway. I thought about what I'd said to Marcus. We proceed. What you said at the gala is on record, I said. A room full of journalists heard it. Several of them wrote about it. I'm not the audience for your apology, Daniel. The women who are still at that firm are. He was quiet for a moment. What would you need to see? From Northgate. To reconsider. Resolve the OSC disclosure. Stabilize your leadership team. Publish a transparent people and culture report before the listing. I paused. And make a public statement clarifying your remarks at the gala. Not a clarification, a retraction. Another pause. Longer this time. That last one isn't a standard investment condition, he said. No, I said. It's not. My daughter reached me. She held up the drawing. It was a house with a very large sun and two figures, one taller, one smaller, standing outside it. I took it carefully with my free hand. I'll be in touch, Daniel said. Take your time, I said. We're not going anywhere. I want to tell you what happened over the following months, not because I think this story is about winning. I've lived long enough to know that framing things that way misses the point. What happened was this. Northgate Systems addressed the OSC disclosure matter. They brought in an independent HR consultant who produced a public-facing culture audit, the kind of thing that is increasingly expected by institutional ESG-focused investors, which is most of them. 2 of the departing senior leaders were retained through revised equity arrangements. The one who had already accepted an offer left, as she should have. And Daniel Marsh published a statement. It ran in the Globe and Mail's Report on Business section and in 2 legal industry publications. It referenced his remarks at the gala directly. It used the word maternity. It did not use the word clarification. His communications people had clearly tried to soften it in drafting, and something in the final version still felt lawyered. But the retraction was there, in print, attached to his name, on the record. Thornfield Capital completed its investment in the Northgate IPO in the second quarter of the following year. The listing was successful. The stock opened at a premium to its issue price. Our position performed in line with our models. I was not in the room for the listing day celebration. I was in Canmore with my daughter for the week, watching her attempt to convince a very patient Labrador retriever to share its stick. She was almost 2.5 by then, and she approached every negotiation with a seriousness that made me want to cry and laugh at the same time. Marcus sent me a message that afternoon. It said, "Good result." Then a period. He communicates efficiently. I put my phone away and went back outside. There is something I want to say about what people call revenge, because I have thought about it a great deal. I don't think what I did was revenge. I think it was accountability arriving through the only door left open. The professional door. The one Daniel himself had built and operated in for his entire career. I didn't destroy Northgate. I didn't ruin him. I made him answer, in the currency he valued most, for something he decided didn't need an answer. The women who worked at Whitmore and Marsh, the ones who left quietly and signed their agreements and got on with things, they didn't need me to perform anything on their behalf. They were already getting on with it. But sometimes the people who dismiss you need to be shown, specifically and concretely, what it costs. Not so you can feel better. So they understand that it costs. My daughter has never asked me about any of this. She's too young. One day she will ask me something like it, in the language her own life will hand her. I hope by then I will have figured out how to explain that the goal was never to prove I was more than a housewife, more than a mother on leave, more than the woman someone underestimated. The goal was simpler than that. The goal was to remain exactly who I was, fully, without apology, and to let the work speak in the rooms where it needed to be heard. She started walking at 13 months. She said her first clear word at 10 months it was more, which I found both alarming and deeply appropriate. She learned to negotiate before she learned to read. I see myself in her in ways that make me both proud and slightly concerned for whoever ends up across a table from her in 30 years. Marcus and I are currently running due diligence on 3 new companies. One is in clean energy infrastructure. One is a health tech platform that came out of a UBC research lab. One is a small but remarkable logistics startup in Halifax that I found through a referral from one of those former Whitmore and Marsh associates who is now the COO of a mid-sized firm in Waterloo and is, by every measure, thriving. I think about the gala sometimes. Not often. I don't carry the anger the way I thought I might. What I carry instead is something closer to clarity, the particular kind that settles in when you stop performing modesty about what you're capable of and start simply doing it. The night after the listing, I got a short email from one of the women who had been at Whitmore and Marsh and left around the same time I did. She had seen the statement. She didn't mention the IPO or Thornfield. She may not have known, or may have guessed and said nothing, which amounts to the same thing. She wrote, "I saw the piece in the Globe. I hope you're well." And then, "Thank you." That's all. I read it twice. I saved it to a folder I don't open very often. The Labrador's name, I later found out, was Oliver. He did eventually share the stick. My daughter carried it all the way back to the car and insisted on bringing it into the rental cottage, which I allowed because some negotiations aren't worth having. I'm still not sure she lost that one. If this story landed for you in some way, if you know what it is to be looked past, to be quietly moved aside, to be handed an assumption that says you've already chosen which version of yourself you get to be, I hope you know that the work you're doing in the margins, in the narrow windows, in the in-between hours that nobody is counting, is not invisible. It is capital. It is compounding. And it will find its moment. Subscribe if you want to stay in this with us. Drop a comment if something here struck you. And take care of yourselves out there.